Okay, guys, so today for our conversation, I'd like to start a new topic, industry and immigration. This is going to be broken up into a few different conversations. And so at the beginning of each one, I'll show this slide, and it's really just terms to be on the lookout for. This is going to be throughout the entire topic 2 or chapter 2 of our text. We should at some point during our conversation hit on each and every one of these people, places, or ideas. So as we go through, just like last time, be on the lookout for one of those little stars. It means that that slide contains one or even more of these ideas. So hopefully you can look through and think to yourself, okay, cash crop, I already know what that is. John D. Rockefeller, I already know what that is. So hopefully there are some that you can already sort of mentally check off your list. Otherwise, just be on the lookout for them as we move. Also, just some sort of guiding ideas, some guiding things that we can think about as we continue our conversation about industrialization and immigration. So, think about how in the late 1800s we see rapid industrialization, which means things are changing literally overnight. This rapid industrialization will be driven by entrepreneurs, people whose names we will learn and need to know, innovators. They will change our lives in America. Those have both positive and negative consequences that we will be looking at. Americans will try to address some of those negative consequences, some of those effects of industrialization. In the late 1800s, we also see a new surge in immigration, this time from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as from Asia. We will see a growth of cities, a rapid urbanization, just like a rapid industrialization, and also look at new technologies and cultural movements in the United States. So, again, just like you were on the lookout for the terms on the slide before, make sure you are on the lookout for the ideas and themes in this slide here. We should be able to explain the economic effect of technological innovations. We should be able to understand how the free enterprise system impacted the rise of entrepreneurship, to know what impact energy and natural resources have on the American way of life, to understand mass production and understand its impact, to know what technological innovations impacted agriculture and specific issues related to agriculture in the South. Because although we sort of feel like we are light years away from the Civil War and Reconstruction, we are right in the aftermath of all of that. And remember, Reconstruction sort of failed, right? Well, we can debate the relative success of Reconstruction, certainly in rebuilding the Southern economy. And there are going to be some lingering infrastructure issues in the South. We want to talk about how management innovations help businesses gain an advantage, to know the causes and effects and the definition of social Darwinism, to understand monopolies and how the United States over the years has attempted to regulate those monopolies, and also to explain economic opportunities, both denied and available, to immigrants, and understand the impact of nativism. So I like this slide right here, this little flow chart here. Actually, I don't think that technically is a flow chart, but regardless, this second industrial revolution. So industry had come to the United States before the Civil War, but we didn't really embrace it in the United States. We still remain a very heavily agricultural nation. After the Civil War, through this rebuilding process, we do start to adopt industry. And the second industrialization in the United States is characterized by an expansion of railroads, a growth of factories and growth of production in those factories, massive profits for business tycoons that we are going to introduce the idea of the robber baron here in a minute. Emerging labor unions, so workers advocating for their rights. We have Labor Day, right? The coming of electricity, communication revolutions, advances in transportation. We're going to be talking about the railroads. Difficult conditions for industrial workers. We'll look at some images related to that. New forms of business organization and the development of steel and oil industry. So all of these or ideas that we are going to associate with the second industrial revolution. And I mentioned the word rapid industrialization or the phrase rapid industrialization before. It really is so fast. Almost overnight, the United States not just industrializes quickly, but becomes the world's leading industrial power. What's happening in the South? So, as this slide says, while industry booms in the North after the Civil War, the South falls behind. There are pockets of industry that develop in the South, but the majority of the South stays very agricultural, while the North grows urban areas. The South stays rural. And it starts or continues, not starts, continues this sort of north-south divide of the economy. The large cities during the early years of the Second Industrial Revolution are going to be Atlanta and Knoxville, believe it or not. But again, a middle class that starts to develop in the North, this sort of leisure class, does not develop in the South. And so you continue to have very, very, very wealthy, not plantation owners, well, not in the sense that we think of in the Civil War, right? But landowners, think about sharecropping, or poor farmers. And you see that sort of illustrated here with the distribution of income and the distribution of population. So 1860 to 1880, the areas in purple are the rest of the nation. The areas in blue are the South. The distribution of income really changes from 1860 to 1880, but the distribution of population doesn't. So the South's percentage of income relative to its population fell after the Civil War. What does that decline in distribution of income tell you about the South's economy? That's something that I'm going to want you to think about and come back to me with. So why is the United States so successful when it comes to industry? Well, we have a whole lot of natural resources, things like coal, iron, and we have a lot of those resources. And if you have a lot of that, it means that those resources are cheap. The catch here is that the United States has to get to those resources, and then we have to get those resources back to where the factories are. The resources are out west. The factories are out east. We have to move people out west to mine the materials. We have to transport them back east where they can be turned into finished goods. This is where railroads are going to be very, very important. There's also going to be a new desire for petroleum, which is going to lead to the growth of the oil industry. It's all going to start with the desire of factory owners to have their workers work later hours, further into the evening, and to do that they need kerosene lamps. Another wonderful chart for us, you can see the growth in mineral production in the United States relative to the growth of the U.S. economy. And it says what relationship exists between the increase in natural resource production and economic growth. I mentioned resources that the United States has access to, and population workforce is going to be another resource. The U.S. population almost triples between 1860 and 1910, and you can see down below where that growth is happening and where these cities are. And if you think about a population boom and what it does for industrialization, it creates a workforce to produce items, but it also creates population to purchase those items. So it creates both supply and demand, so to speak. And those families are growing, or the population is growing due to both immigration and larger families. Children are surviving into adulthood. This is a woman in Alabama in a textile mill, a symbol of the New South. Maybe, right? Is it the New South or is it not? Okay, so we have said that you have to have innovation in order to have this sort of level of rapid industrialization. And you can see a lot of people are mentioned here, who each individual inventor is, the date that their invention is patented, and the process or machine that the inventor is responsible for. It's everything from the guy who produced the first mechanized passenger elevator all the way to the light bulb. It also includes someone named Henry Bessemer, who's responsible for something called the Bessemer process. It essentially helps us create steel from iron ore. So I've got a neat little video about the chemistry of that and what that sort of looks like in a forge as it's being produced.
Making steel in massive quantities was one of the great technological challenges of the Industrial Revolution. But it turns out that the secret to creating this mega material was known as far back as 300 BC, when it was made in India and Sri Lanka. The trick to creating this metal was in getting the exact right combination of steel's two main components, iron and carbon. But today, steel is everywhere. So how did it become the workhorse of the modern world? The answer is Henry Bessemer. Bessemer was a British scientist who in 1856 figured out an efficient way to turn iron and carbon into steel. He did it by using hot blasts of oxygen inside a specialized furnace to reduce the amount of carbon in the metal.
The Bessemer process made steel production far more efficient than it ever had been in history.
If you want to make good, high-quality steel, you blow pure oxygen through the iron, and this oxidizes the carbon that is in the iron.
With temperatures over 2,000 degrees, the oxygen is literally burning the carbon out of the steel. Every day, 17,000 tons of iron ore pours into the furnaces at the ArcelorMittal steel mill in Cleveland, Ohio. And each year, this sprawling 1,000-acre facility single-handedly cranks out enough raw steel to build a train track around the globe.
This plant is the most efficient integrated steel plant anywhere in the world.
There's always a hot stove online.
Foundries like this one use extreme heat and heavy machinery to blast away impurities from the iron ore and infuse carbon, creating a metal stronger, more flexible, and less dense than iron. Turning low-grade ore into the most used metal in the world starts at a 200-foot-tall furnace. This is where the iron ore is hit with heat generated by a type of fuel called coke.
Coke is a result of burning the impurities and the junk out of coal that you don't need to get to the good stuff, which is going to burn cleanly and give you the nice, hot, clean fire that you need to make steel.
It's called the blast furnace because as the ore and coke flow downward, they're met by a 1,600-degree blast of hot air, moving at 110,000 cubic feet per minute.
The wind is coming in at what we call the Bosch level of the furnace through nozzles, which are called tuyeres, and we have 18 of them, depending on the size of the blast furnace. That air is pushing up through a solid burden material.
The superheated air ignites the coke, like charcoal in a grill, and heats up the furnace to nearly 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At this temperature, the oxygen is finally blasted away, leaving pure molten iron. But it's also doing something even more amazing. As the heat from the coke flame strips away the oxygen, the carbon in the coke is bonding to the iron.
You have hot blasts going in, you have the material going in at the top of the furnace, and it's melting, and as it's melting, it's going down.
Under the extreme heat, the mixture liquefies. Impurities like silica and sulfur rise to the top. The heavier iron sinks to the bottom, where it's drawn out in a glowing molten stream.
The furnace until it turns into liquid, and it comes out the tap hole.
Every 45 minutes, some 500 tons of molten metal, called pig iron, gushes from the tap. It's called pig iron because it was originally cast into molds resembling piglets suckling a sow. But ironically, though the iron has been freed from the oxygen, the molten pig iron that flows from the furnace has a new problem: too much carbon. Over 4%, which makes the resulting metal much too brittle. To become steel, that number needs to be reduced to less than 2%.
It's all one continuous process.
We want a very specific strength level. We need the carbon in a very critical range.
To get it right, the carbon-loaded pig iron must undergo one final treatment in the oxygen furnace. Inside this iron cask, the molten steel, already at more than 2,000 degrees, is blasted with jets of pure oxygen. The molten steel ignites the oxygen, only this time the fuel isn't coke. It's the actual carbon atoms bonded to the iron. Basically, the molten material itself is burning.
We flow 25,000 cubic feet of oxygen per minute into the bath in the vessel. The oxygen reacts with the carbon and reduces the carbon level.
The longer and hotter it burns, the more the carbon burns away. The molten metal that pours from the chamber is now a perfect blend of soft iron and brittle carbon. A metal that is strong but ductile, hard but malleable, and forms into solid glowing slabs, ready to span rivers and plow through the ocean. This is steel. But the steel is still red hot, with a temperature over 1,000 degrees. So the metal is transferred to a series of casters and rollers, where it's cooled with water and reduced from 75,000-pound 9-inch slabs to a ribbon just 3/4 of an inch thick. The entire furnace process takes just 2.5 hours to turn the natural mined substance of iron ore into the world's most widely used high-strength metal.
We are very proud. Without us, a lot of stuff can't be made.
Okay, so he's right. He should be proud because without them, nothing can be made, or not very much can be made. So there's a roll of steel right there that's going to be used to produce so many important items. Northern entrepreneurs. Well, let's talk about laissez-faire and let's talk about tariffs. So laissez-faire means hands off. It's an idea that is first sort of written by an economist or pioneered by an economist named Adam Smith, and he believed that the government should stay out of the business of regulating stay out of the business of regulating the economy. And that is pretty much going to be the dominant economic theory in the United States until, the Great Depression happens. We realize, well, maybe we need some more regulation. I also want to mention the idea of a tariff. If you remember what a tariff is, it is a tax on an import. And tariffs will be politically controversial. If you are a factory owner in the North, then you like tariffs. You want high tariffs because it means that it incentivizes the American public to buy American goods. So let's say that you are a factory owner in the North at a New England factory and you can sell your product for $1. But a good from Britain is shipped in and it is selling for 50 cents. Well, the American public is going to buy the 50-cent good as opposed to your $1 good. But if the government puts a tax on imports or a tariff, and now all of a sudden that British produced good costs $1.50 to your $1 American good, then it means that the American people will buy your cheaper good. So a tariff is a tax on imports. Now, in the South, they do not like tariffs because they're still primarily agricultural in the South. So they want cheaper items, right? They want to be able to buy that 50-cent British good. But the second reason is that because they are still agricultural, they are still shipping a good bit of their product to Europe. And if the United States puts a tariff on European goods, then European countries will put a tariff on American goods. And that is going to be quite costly to the Southern landowner trying to sell their product overseas. So understand that there is a controversy about tariffs, and also understand how this sort of hands-off idea in terms of business regulation creates this free enterprise system that creates competition, ideally, that will allow wages to be set by the market, which is not necessarily a good thing. And also how it allows for these individual entrepreneurs to become so incredibly wealthy and amass these huge fortunes, and also amass these giant businesses that today we would call monopolies. And that eventually the American government has to say, well, maybe one person shouldn't own all of the oil refineries. Maybe that's not actually good for competition, but maybe it is posing a problem for competition. And we will get to that here in this chapter when we talk about, like, for example, the Sherman Antitrust Act a bit later on. Oh, my little stars. Okay, so I'm going to also mention the railroads because they are so important. I mean, I mentioned on that first slide, you don't have railroads, you don't have access to the natural resources out west, you can't ship those natural resources back east, you don't have industry. It is just that simple. But railroads are incredibly expensive, and so they require a lot of investment, and that investment is going to come from wealthy businessmen, right, capitalists, but also from the government in the form of something called a land grant, which we'll get to in a second. But if you just look at that number right there, the explosion of railroad track from 1865, we have 35,000 miles of railroad track. All the way into 1900, you have 200,000 miles of railroad track. It's railroad companies like the Union Pacific, the Central Pacific, and the Northern Pacific that are going to build their tracks during this time period. In 1862, you have the Pacific Railway Act, which is going to sort of be the initiative that starts the Transcontinental Railway. It goes so fast because it's finished in only 4 years. The labor of building this track was primarily Chinese immigrants, who will be discussed in a little bit, and the working conditions are incredibly brutal, and there's a large loss of life. I shouldn't say primarily Chinese immigrants. There's a good amount of Chinese immigrants. There's also a good amount of Irish immigrants and others. Time zones are established because of the railroads. This need to ensure that you understood if you left Boston on a train, what time you would arrive in Kansas City, and that it wouldn't change based on what city you were in or even what region you were in, as long as you understood the time zones. Think about how railroads affected the distribution of goods. Kind of mentioned this before when we talked about the growth of the U.S. population, about how it created both a capability to supply goods and also a demand for purchasing those goods. The same thing happens with the railroad out west. If more people live out west, there's more of a need for a railroad to be built out west. So there is a great incentive for railroad companies to try to get people to move out west. And this is where this land grant system comes in. The U.S. governments want the railroad to be built, right? Because they understand how important it will be for the United States economically. So we want the railroad built. The U.S. government says, we will give you, railroad companies, a whole bunch of money. And if you take this money and you run with it and you build your railroad on this land, or not money, they're going to give them a whole bunch of land. And you build your railroad on this land and sort of wash your hands of it. The railroad will then, build their railroad on the land and then take the rest of it, because it's a sizable amount of land, right? Railroads are not gigantic. They will take the rest of it and they will sell it. And they will sell it to settlers, and they will then pocket that money. So it's a pretty significant amount of money that railroad companies end up getting under this land grant system. Robber barons, when I discuss with railroads, because we're talking about getting rich and the potential for corruption and all that, robber barons is not a nice term, kind of a derogatory term used to describe entrepreneurs who are going to amass incredible amounts of wealth. The Vanderbilts, right? Cornelius Vanderbilt, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, J.D. Rockefeller, these entrepreneurs and venture capitalists who are going to risk it all and also be incredibly successful. And they do not always have the greatest of reputations amongst the American workforce, right? We eventually are going to be talking about unions and sort of the bad conditions that the workers were operating under. But we will be talking about how the American public and the American people viewed unions. This is a political cartoon from a magazine called Puck, which we're going to look at in your folder a little more closely. But if you look at it, you see these entrepreneurs who are, their shirts essentially have dollar signs on them, right? They are just giant bags of money if you look at their collars. These giant money bags, literally, who are on this raft that is full of, goods that are being produced on the literal backs of the American worker, many of whom are immigrants. You can see that sort of come to our shores looking for work. The text at the bottom says, protectors of our industries. And we can certainly debate whether or not that is tongue-in-cheek and who that's referring to. Is it referring to the worker on whose backs industry is being built, or to the robber barons on the top of that raft? Again, we're going to break this image down further a bit later on. The Northern Railroad is another railroad that I mentioned earlier that didn't get a lot of press in the Transcontinental Railroad, but comes around a bit later on and is actually going to be built without federal land grants or subsidies. Subsidies. Did I say that right? I'm not sure. Another political cartoon. Here's a robber baron. We're going to talk about this more as well, sort of gobbling up all of the railroad lines. What does the robber baron in this cartoon represent? Okay, so this is definitely a be continued kind of conversation. If you have any questions, please let me know.